April 29, 1945. The sky over a remote German countryside is pale and cool, the faint scent of smoke lingering from distant battles. Barbed wire stretches across a camp where women sit in silence, worn and hollowed by months of imprisonment. Their clothes are tattered, hands rough from forced labor, and eyes hollow yet alert, scanning for any sign of change. The quiet is broken by the distant roar of engines, jeeps and armored vehicles moving along the dirt road toward the camp. Suddenly, figures in uniform appear at the gate. American soldiers, faces resolute but calm, approach with careful authority. Confusion mixes with hope. The women rise, hesitant, unsure if this is another test of obedience or the promise of liberation. Then the gates swing open. Tears brim, breaths catch, and some women collapse to the ground, overcome by the realization that captivity has ended. In that instant, fear dissolves into relief. Mothers clutch younger prisoners, friends embrace, and the weight of months of suffering lifts, if only momentarily. Freedom has arrived, carried by the rhythm of engines, the crack of gates, and the presence of strangers who bring both safety and salvation. By early 1945, as Allied forces advanced deeper into Germany, the network of prisoner-of-war camps became a focal point of both logistical concern and humanitarian urgency. Among these camps were facilities specifically housing female prisoners, many of whom had been captured for resistance activities, espionage, or military labor roles. The camps were often overcrowded, poorly maintained, and located in isolated areas, making supply and oversight difficult. Allied intelligence and operational planning increasingly emphasized the importance of securing and liberating these prisoners as part of broader campaigns, both to uphold international law and to provide moral legitimacy to the liberation effort. The daily life within these camps was a stark portrait of deprivation and resilience. Women were assigned grueling labor, from factory work to agricultural duties, often with insufficient food and medical care. Rations were minimal, leaving many weak, malnourished, and vulnerable to disease. Sanitation was frequently inadequate, and outbreaks of illness were common. Despite these harsh conditions, prisoners developed social networks that sustained psychological well-being. Women shared food, offered emotional support, and organized secret educational or cultural activities to preserve morale. Captivity exacted a heavy psychological toll. Fear of violence, uncertainty about the war's outcome, and separation from family created constant stress. Letters from home were rare or delayed, and rumors of advancing Allied troops often brought a mix of hope and anxiety. The women learned to navigate these pressures with caution, balancing compliance with guards against small acts of autonomy that preserved dignity and identity. Their experience highlighted the intersection of survival, human adaptability, and the endurance of the spirit under extreme circumstances. The Allied strategy for liberating these camps relied on coordinated intelligence, ground operations, and careful timing. Military planners had to consider the proximity of front lines, the risk of remaining German forces, and the need to secure supplies for liberated prisoners. Logistics were critical. Food, medical care, and transportation had to be ready before liberation to prevent chaos and starvation once the gates opened. Specialized units were trained to handle civilian and prisoner interactions, recognizing the potential for emotional volatility and the need for immediate stabilization of liberated populations. Female prisoners, in particular, faced unique vulnerabilities. Isolation from male counterparts meant limited access to protective networks common in co-ed camps. Women often bore the brunt of physical and psychological abuse, yet they also developed remarkable coping mechanisms: communal support, the sharing of scarce resources, and quiet acts of resistance, preserving personal hygiene, maintaining social bonds, and safeguarding vulnerable inmates, became central to survival. Their experiences illustrate how gender shaped both vulnerability and resilience in captivity. By late April 1945, the conditions in these camps were reaching critical points. Allied forces, having broken through German defenses in multiple regions, were approaching key facilities. Intelligence reports highlighted the weakened physical state of prisoners, the scarcity of food, and the deteriorating health conditions. For military planners, liberating these camps was not only a moral imperative, but a strategic necessity. Delayed action could result in mass fatalities, further complicating post-war recovery and undermining the Allies' humanitarian credibility. The context of captivity, deprivation, and strategic planning set the stage for the dramatic liberation that would follow. The juxtaposition of oppressive confinement and the impending arrival of freedom created a charged emotional landscape. For the women inside, the gates symbolized not just escape, but survival, restoration of dignity, and the promise of life beyond barbed wire. Understanding this context illuminates both the stakes of liberation and the profound human significance of the moment when freedom arrived. Life within the camps was defined by routine, scarcity, and constant vigilance. German female prisoners navigated a world of rigid schedules, enforced labor, and limited personal autonomy. Each day began before dawn, often with exhausting physical work, followed by sparse meals and minimal rest. Sanitation facilities were inadequate, and illnesses spread quickly, exacerbated by overcrowding and poor nutrition. Despite these conditions, prisoners developed informal support networks, helping one another survive both physically and emotionally. Sharing food, comforting the sick, and providing companionship became crucial acts of solidarity. Psychologically, captivity exerted relentless pressure. The uncertainty of the war's outcome, the fate of loved ones, and fear of retribution created a pervasive sense of anxiety. Women learned to measure hope carefully, balancing optimism with realism to avoid further emotional collapse. Letters from family, if they arrived, were treasured and read repeatedly, providing a fragile lifeline to the outside world. Prisoners developed small routines and rituals, quiet acts of personal hygiene, storytelling, and secret educational exchanges to preserve a sense of identity and control. These small efforts became anchors in a life dominated by external authority and deprivation. Social dynamics within the camps were complex. Hierarchies emerged based on labor assignments, age, health, and personal influence. Older women often assumed mentoring roles, guiding younger prisoners in both survival skills and emotional management. Camaraderie was both a necessity and a shield against despair. Women protected each other from guards' harsh treatment when possible, mediated conflicts, and coordinated mutual support in accessing limited resources. These networks reinforced resilience, demonstrating the human capacity to adapt even in extreme confinement. The anticipation of liberation added another layer of tension. News of advancing Allied troops reached the camps through rumors, smuggled notes, or distant sounds of artillery. Each report sparked a mixture of hope and fear. Women wondered whether freedom would truly arrive, or if it would be delayed, bringing further suffering. This uncertainty heightened emotional strain, forcing prisoners to remain alert and resourceful while conserving energy for potential escape or survival scenarios. Allied planning for liberation was meticulous. Military units preparing to enter the camps had to account for potential resistance, logistical needs, and the welfare of prisoners. Food, medical care, and shelter were pre-positioned to prevent chaos once the gates opened. Psychological preparedness was equally critical. Soldiers were briefed on how to manage the intense emotional reactions of liberated prisoners, recognizing that hysteria, tears, and even panic could erupt spontaneously. For the women, these operations would unfold as a combination of surprise, astonishment, and overwhelming relief. The conditions inside the camps amplified the emotional impact of liberation. After months of hardship, every gesture, from the opening of gates to the appearance of uniformed soldiers, carried profound significance. For mothers, daughters, and friends, the first steps toward freedom symbolized not only the end of suffering, but the reclamation of personal agency, dignity, and hope. The deprivation and trauma experienced in captivity created a stark contrast with the care, attention, and structured planning of the liberators, intensifying the psychological relief experienced by the women. This context, harsh captivity combined with meticulous liberation. Planning sets the stage for understanding the liberation's multiple dimensions. It frames the story in human, tactical, and moral terms, highlighting the stakes for both prisoners and soldiers. The next section will explore these perspectives, beginning with the tactical and logistical angles that enabled the operation to succeed. The liberation of German female prisoners required precision, coordination, and adaptability. Allied military planners faced multiple challenges: locating camps in remote or partially destroyed regions, ensuring safe passage through contested territories, and preparing for the immediate needs of prisoners once freed. Intelligence units meticulously mapped the camps, noting guard placements, prisoner numbers, and surrounding terrain. Every operation was timed to minimize risk, often synchronized with broader advances on the front lines to prevent German reinforcements from interfering. Transport and logistical planning were central to the success of the operation. Armored vehicles, jeeps, and trucks were dispatched to maintain order and provide rapid mobility. Medical teams accompanied liberation units, prepared to administer first aid for malnutrition, disease, and injuries sustained in captivity. Food supplies, blankets, and clothing were pre-positioned to prevent post-liberation chaos. Drop points for essential resources were carefully chosen, ensuring accessibility and efficiency. These measures reflected the understanding that liberation was not merely the opening of gates. It was the safe transition from confinement to survival. Tactical execution required flexibility. Liberators navigated destroyed infrastructure, mines, and unpredictable weather, adjusting plans in real time. Units advanced cautiously, ensuring minimal confrontation with remaining German forces while maintaining momentum toward the camps. Communication networks were vital. Signal corps and liaison officers coordinated between infantry, supply convoys, and medical teams. This orchestration allowed soldiers to respond immediately to unforeseen challenges, protecting both prisoners and troops. The design of liberation operations also considered psychological dynamics. Soldiers were briefed on the expected reactions of prisoners: shock, disbelief, hysteria, or tears. Officers prepared contingency plans to manage large groups safely, directing them to assembly areas and providing immediate reassurance. This combination of tactical foresight and logistical precision minimized potential injuries and confusion, ensuring that liberation became a controlled, life-saving operation rather than a chaotic event. Engineering and technology played a supporting role. Bridges were repaired or bypassed to facilitate transport. Temporary field hospitals were erected for immediate care, and supply trucks were loaded with pre-sorted rations and medical kits. Every detail, from ration packaging to vehicle routing, was calibrated to deliver maximum effect under challenging circumstances. The operation's success depended not only on military prowess, but on the seamless integration of planning, technology, and human judgment. For the prisoners themselves, the tactical and logistical success of liberation became immediately tangible. Gates opened, vehicles rolled in, and medical teams began triage. The careful sequencing of the operation ensured that prisoners were not only freed, but also received nourishment, clothing, and medical attention without delay. Women, many weakened by months of deprivation, could grasp the packages, blankets, and assistance provided, translating complex operational planning into immediate relief. The precision and adaptability of the Allied forces underscore the interplay between strategy and human experience. Every logistical decision, from the placement of trucks to the timing of gates opening, directly affected survival and morale. For the liberated women, The operation's efficiency transformed disbelief into astonishment, fear into relief, and captivity into the first steps of renewed life. For German female prisoners, liberation was a moment that defied comprehension. Months of confinement, deprivation, and fear had conditioned them to expect only hardship. Suddenly, gates opened, soldiers appeared, and vehicles arrived with food, blankets, and medical attention. The astonishment was immediate and overwhelming. Tears flowed freely, voices caught in gasps, and some women fell to the ground, overcome by the sudden release from months of suffering. Mothers embraced children or younger prisoners. Friends clung to one another, and the emotional intensity was palpable. The psychological relief was profound. Daily life in the camps had been defined by scarcity, rigid routines, and fear. Every action required calculation, rationing food, navigating guard behavior, and preserving emotional stability. Liberation replaced uncertainty with tangible support. Women received nourishment for the first time in weeks, access to medical care, and reassurance that their survival was now possible. This transition from constant vigilance to immediate relief generated a mixture of joy, disbelief, and cautious optimism. Social dynamics shifted dramatically. Prisoners who had relied on informal hierarchies and support networks now became active participants in distributing aid and organizing small groups for safety. Women assumed leadership roles instinctively, guiding others to food, medical assistance, and blankets, while mediating disputes that arose from the sudden influx of resources. These acts reinforced community cohesion and demonstrated the prisoners' resilience, resourcefulness, and moral strength. The moral dimension of liberation was equally significant. The women confronted a complex awareness of their captors and liberators. Harsh memories of captivity contrasted with the immediate kindness of the soldiers, challenging preconceived notions of authority and human behavior. Gratitude coexisted with lingering trauma, creating a nuanced emotional response. Women reflected on the fragility of life, the injustice of imprisonment, and the transformative potential of compassion. Children, younger women, and older prisoners responded differently, but with equal intensity. Laughter, sobs, and whispers of disbelief intermingled, producing a tableau of raw human emotion. Mothers and caretakers became anchors, ensuring the vulnerable were protected while channeling the collective astonishment into manageable action. The communal response highlighted the interplay between individual emotion and shared experience. This human and emotional perspective illuminates why the liberation's impact extended beyond immediate survival. While tactical precision and logistical planning provided the framework, it was the women's response, tears, astonishment, leadership, and moral reflection that gave liberation its full significance. Their reactions transformed strategic intervention into lived historical experience, marking a profound turning point in both personal and collective narratives. April 29, 1945, marked a pivotal moment for German female prisoners in several camps across southern Germany. Allied units, advancing steadily after breaching the last German defensive lines, approached isolated facilities with calculated precision. In one camp, nestled near a wooded valley, women gathered near the barbed wire fence, their movements cautious and tentative. They had learned over months of deprivation to distrust sudden changes. Yet a distant hum of engines signaled an unfamiliar presence. Armored jeeps and trucks appeared along the dirt road, soldiers stepping down with calm authority, weapons lowered. Officers signaled to release gates while medical teams prepared for immediate assessment. The first prisoners approached cautiously, hesitant to believe what they saw. Then a gate swung open, and the reality of liberation struck. Women froze for a moment, disbelief mingling with joy, before emotion overwhelmed composure. Tears streamed freely, laughter punctuated sobs, and mothers clutched children, grounding them even as they themselves were swept by astonishment. The operation's success lay in its meticulous orchestration. Soldiers moved methodically, guiding prisoners to secure assembly points and distributing blankets, food, and medical attention without delay. Vehicles ferried those too weak to walk, while medical personnel triaged malnourished and injured prisoners. Every detail, timing, positioning, and sequencing ensured that the initial shock of freedom did not descend into chaos. The sensory impact was immediate. Women inhaled the crisp air beyond the camp, a stark contrast to months of confinement and stale, overcrowded quarters. Sunlight touched their faces in a way they had forgotten, and the sound of birds, distant artillery fading behind them, seemed almost unreal. Mothers held children close, guiding them through the first steps of liberty, while older prisoners reached for friends and neighbors, reinforcing bonds forged in captivity. Emotional intensity escalated as groups were led to supply points. Rations and blankets provided sustenance, yet it was the symbolic weight of choice, movement, and agency that truly marked the turning point. Women who had been confined by schedules, labor, and fear now made decisions: who would receive food first, how to distribute blankets, and how to care for those too weak to participate. These acts of immediate leadership showcased resilience born from months of hardship. The liberators themselves observed the profound effect. Soldiers, aware of the emotional magnitude, allowed space for prisoners to process the reality of freedom. Officers coordinated logistics while witnessing mothers weep openly. Young women embrace friends, and communities reorganize spontaneously. The careful balance of authority, protection, and empathy amplified the success of the operation, transforming a tactical maneuver into a human triumph. By the end of the day, the camp was a scene of mixed emotions: joy, disbelief, relief, and cautious optimism. Prisoners began to articulate plans for reunification with family, movement to safer areas, and recovery from months of deprivation. The initial liberation, executed with tactical precision, marked the first tangible step toward a future no longer defined by confinement. In the days following the initial liberation, the full impact of freedom became increasingly visible. Camps across southern Germany experienced similar operations, each meticulously planned to ensure safety, efficiency, and the immediate welfare of prisoners. Vehicles transported the weakest women to medical stations, while stronger prisoners assisted one another in collecting rations and blankets. Mothers guided children through the first steps of liberty, balancing astonishment with practical concern. The initial disbelief that had frozen many prisoners gave way to tears, laughter, and communal organization. The sustained relief underscored the tactical foresight of Allied forces. Supply trucks arrived with pre-sorted food, clean clothing, and essential medical equipment, ensuring that the transition from captivity to survival did not descend into disorder. Soldiers coordinated closely with camp leadership, often relying on the prisoners themselves to manage queues, prioritize care, and distribute resources efficiently. Women, drawing on months of experience surviving under deprivation, immediately assumed these roles, translating operational planning into tangible outcomes. Emotionally, the liberation was overwhelming. Women wept openly, some collapsing in relief as decades of fear and scarcity lifted in moments. Children, previously pale and malnourished, pressed against mothers or older sisters, eyes wide with incredulous joy. The juxtaposition of prolonged suffering with sudden abundance intensified the psychological release. Mothers and caregivers became anchors, guiding younger prisoners, maintaining order, and reinforcing social bonds fractured by months of isolation and deprivation. This period also revealed the moral dimensions of liberation. Prisoners reflected on the paradox of former enemies bringing salvation. Gratitude coexisted with lingering trauma, creating complex emotional landscapes. Women acknowledged the horrors of their captivity, while experiencing the profound humanity extended by their liberators. The acts of care, medical attention, distribution of food, blankets, and reassurance transformed strategic operations into deeply personal experiences of hope and moral renewal. By the end of the first week, camps began to stabilize. Routines emerged as women organized collective kitchens, prioritized medical care, and supported those still weak from confinement. Neighborhood-like structures developed within the liberated spaces, reflecting both the prisoners' ingenuity and the careful planning of Allied personnel. The transition from fear to agency highlighted resilience. Women who had endured months of restriction now guided others, ensuring equitable access to scarce resources and reinforcing communal solidarity. The climax of liberation was not a single moment, but a process. The arrival of soldiers, the opening of gates, the first distribution of supplies, and the slow restoration of autonomy. Each phase compounded the psychological, physical, and social impact, transforming astonishment into practical recovery. The liberated women became both witnesses and participants in this turning point, embodying resilience, leadership, and hope. The immediate aftermath of liberation revealed the profound consequences for German female prisoners. Freed from confinement, women faced both relief and responsibility. They were no longer constrained by barbed wire, yet many were still physically weakened, malnourished, and emotionally fragile. Allied forces ensured that essential medical care, food, and clothing were available immediately, but it was the prisoners' initiative that translated these provisions into recovery. Mothers, elder prisoners, and natural leaders within the camps organized distribution, prioritized care for the weakest, and began rebuilding communal routines. Physical recovery was gradual. Malnutrition, untreated injuries, and illnesses required careful attention. Medical personnel conducted thorough assessments, administered treatment, and monitored recovery, while women adapted to the sudden availability of nourishment. Sleep became deeper and more restorative. Meals, once rationed and sparse, now provided sustenance sufficient to rebuild strength. Blankets, clothing, and personal hygiene items contributed to comfort and dignity, signaling a shift from mere survival to restored humanity. Psychologically, liberation marked a decisive break from months of fear and uncertainty. Prisoners experienced waves of emotion, astonishment, disbelief, joy, and grief, often simultaneously. Diaries and personal testimonies highlight the profound relief and tears of gratitude experienced when first encountering the generosity of liberators. The sudden recognition of freedom created a sense of agency, empowering women to plan, organize, and envision life beyond the camp. Community dynamics evolved rapidly. Women assumed leadership in organizing living spaces, communal kitchens, and care for children and the sick. Their roles extended beyond familial responsibilities, encompassing broader social cohesion within liberated spaces. Collaborative problem-solving, equitable distribution of resources, and moral guidance emerged naturally, reflecting both experience under deprivation and innate resilience. The communal restoration of order reinforced bonds fractured during captivity and created functional networks that would support long-term recovery. The liberation also had broader symbolic significance. For many prisoners, it represented vindication, survival, and the triumph of human dignity over oppression. Emotional responses were often intertwined with moral reflection. Gratitude for liberators, reconciliation with past hardships, and recognition of the strength required to endure captivity. The immediate aftermath highlighted the convergence of tactical success, logistical planning, and human resilience, illustrating that survival depended as much on agency and cooperation as on external aid. In the weeks following liberation, long-term consequences began to take shape. The freed women gradually regained strength, reintegrated into social networks, and began planning for life beyond the camps. While physical recovery was vital, social and emotional reconstruction became equally important. Mothers, Daughters and elder prisoners assumed leadership in rebuilding routines, establishing communal kitchens, organizing shelters, and ensuring equitable access to supplies. These activities reinforced social cohesion and provided a framework for post-war adjustment. Education, communication, and information became priorities. Women sought news of relatives, updates on the war's end, and guidance for relocating or reconnecting with family members. Letters, newspapers, and interactions with Allied personnel provided information essential to rebuilding both practical and emotional life. Women became mediators of this knowledge, sharing updates, coordinating relocation, and facilitating connections among fellow prisoners. Their roles exemplified the intersection of resilience, resourcefulness, and leadership under extraordinary circumstances. The liberation also reshaped perceptions of agency and moral responsibility. Women who had endured captivity now exercised control over their recovery, assuming roles previously denied by circumstance. The ability to organize distribution, care for vulnerable peers, and maintain communal order reinforced self-efficacy and moral authority. Their experience highlighted a broader principle. Survival and recovery are co-created through human action, social cooperation, and structured support. Historical memory preserved the impact of these events. Testimonies, diaries, and interviews emphasized the intensity of the emotional response. Tears, astonishment, relief, and gratitude. Women's leadership in post-liberation organization became central to narratives of recovery, illustrating the crucial role of female agency in shaping the immediate and long-term outcomes of humanitarian interventions. These stories informed post-war understanding of resilience, highlighting how human courage and organization complement logistical and tactical success. By the end of summer 1945, liberated women had established routines, secured basic necessities, and begun reintegration into civilian life. Their communities, rebuilt from both physical ruins and social disruption, reflected the lasting influence of female leadership. Liberation was not an endpoint, but the beginning of reconstruction, physically, socially, and morally. The combined effects of planning, execution, and human response created a template for understanding resilience and recovery in post-war societies. The liberation of German female prisoners stands as a testament to the convergence of planning, courage, and human resilience. What began as a meticulously orchestrated military operation, gates opened, vehicles deployed, rations distributed, became, in the hands and hearts of the liberated women, a profound human moment. Tears, astonishment, and laughter revealed the depth of suffering endured and the intensity of relief at reclaiming freedom. Mothers embraced children, friends reunited, and communities reorganized spontaneously, turning logistical success into lived experience. The psychological and moral impact was immense. Years of captivity, deprivation, and uncertainty had exacted a heavy toll. Yet women's responses, organizing distribution, caring for the weakest, and leading communal recovery, demonstrated resilience and moral strength. Gratitude coexisted with lingering trauma, creating a complex emotional landscape that highlighted both the fragility and fortitude of the human spirit. Liberation was not merely the end of imprisonment. It was the restoration of agency, dignity, and hope. This story illustrates the interplay between human action and strategic planning. Allied forces provided the structure and resources necessary for survival, but it was the women's initiative, leadership, and compassion that transformed liberation into a full realization of life, safety, and community. Their astonishment became purposeful action, translating freedom into recovery, social cohesion, and moral renewal. Ultimately, the liberation of these women illuminates a broader truth about humanity. In the wake of devastation, hope is both delivered and cultivated. Acts of courage, empathy, and leadership, whether by liberators or those freed, create the foundation for survival and recovery. The tears shed upon liberation were not only for the suffering endured, but for the triumph of resilience, compassion, and human dignity. The story of German female prisoners weeping at freedom reminds us that liberation is more than a tactical victory. It is a human one, a convergence of strategic foresight, meticulous planning, and the enduring strength of the human spirit.